Now to a deeply personal examination of the African-American experience. Our next guest is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Trymaine Lee has dedicated his life and career to exploring the intersection between Black life and politics. He was one of the first national reporters to cover the fatal shooting of Black teenager Trayvon Martin back in 2012 and the social justice movement that it sparked. His new book, 1,000 Ways to Die, covers gun violence and systemic racism to discovering his own mortality through a near-death experience. But, as he tells Michelle Martin, reporting on such traumatic topics does take its toll.
Thanks, Christiane. Trymaine Lee, thank you so much for speaking with us.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's a really, gosh, I don't even know what to say. It's a powerful, surprising book that you've written. Surprising in some ways, very revealing and very vulnerable. For people who only know your work, through your journalism, I think it might come as a surprise that you share so much of your own story. So I guess I wanted to start by saying that this isn't the book you started out to write. Tell us about that.
Not at all, Michelle. I didn't set out to open my entire self up and pour myself onto a page the way I did. Originally, the book that I was writing was about the literal cost of gun violence in this country, the cost in a dollar amount, as a way to speak to the cost that we pay as communities and families every single day. But as I was writing this book, and I almost met my own death, it forced me to really look at widening the aperture on violence and how we experience violence within our communities, certainly, but also the silent kind of violence that we carry within us in terms of the trauma that we carry. Much of it tied to the gun and gun violence, but also the long trail of systemic violence that's almost required before triggers are pulled. We
should just tell people what happened is you had a heart attack. I mean, you're only 38 years old, former college athlete. People can see that. You former college football player, didn't have a history of high cholesterol, didn't have any of those other kind of markers, and you had what is commonly called a widowmaker. I mean, you had a blockage in your artery that was so profound that it could have killed you. And the way you describe that, I don't want to take you through that again because I'm sure it was traumatic to experience, but you didn't even go to the hospital right away.
It was a very curious decision as I look back now. But 2 years into writing this book, I suffered this widowmaker heart attack, a 98+% blockage in my left anterior descending artery, the big one that supplies most of the blood to your heart. And with none of those markers, I had to wrestle with what it was that literally almost broke my heart. And at that time, my daughter, who is 13 now, a big girl, hard to believe, at 13, was 5 going on 6 years old. And she was asking me, Daddy, how and why? And to answer her, as I promised her when she was still in the womb that I'd never lie to her, I had to be really honest with myself about what I was carrying. And that was a career of chronicling Black death and survival on the front lines of it. As a young police reporter on the streets, often finding a young man shot dead that looks just like me, seeing the pain in his family's eyes, it was almost always a him, and seeing my own family's pain, but then also carrying a family history going back to the Jim Crow South of almost every generation, our family being touched by some sort of gun violence, whether it's the Jim Crow sort, whether it's at the hand of the state troopers later on, my grandfather's murder, time and again, we've been touched by it.
Why do you think you made that connection? Because it isn't obvious. As you point out, a bullet and a blocked artery are very different things.
Yeah, it was all of those things, Michelle. In my physical healing and my emotional and spiritual healing, which took a couple years, there wasn't a day that went by for a number of years where I didn't think about dying. And I was concerned whether I'm going to make it through the night. It was that kind of emotional weight that I was carrying. But as I got healthier, I took a journey of mindfulness and meditation, and really a clarity set in, and examining how did I, of all people, end up here? And then I had to think no further than all of the sleepless nights that I had for years. For a very long time, it was hard for me to sleep because I'd be wrestling and mulling over the stories I was telling, the literal physical damage on bodies that I was seeing, and understanding what it was, what it means, I should say, to carry that and never fully unpack it. And to cope with that, especially as a young man and a young journalist, what I did was throw myself even further into the work, or drink, or take over-the-counter sleep medication. I was doing all this stuff to calm my subconscious. And so it all kind of just made sense to me. And it certainly shifted me as a person, as a journalist, as a man. But without question, it shifted the trajectory of the book I was writing.
One of the things that you do in the book is you start out with a lot of the stories you've told as a journalist, which is a person was shot. This was the impact on that person. This is what we know about why it happened. This is where the gun came from. But what you also do in this book is you trace the people in your life, in your family tree, who have been affected by gun violence. And then you put them against sort of the backdrop of all the violence that had been taking place around them in their community. Did you know before you started this book that so many members of your family had been touched by gun violence?
I did not, Michelle. I grew up always knowing about my grandfather's murder in 1976, 2 years before I was born. And so I knew intimately, or as intimately as I could possibly know, the space that his absence created and the pain and hurt that it sent through my family, my aunts, my uncles, and certainly my mother. But it took some investigating and reporting to discover the first murder in our family back in 1922 in the Jim Crow South, when my grandmother's 12-year-old brother was shot and killed in a neighboring sundown town.
What's a sundown town? Explain that for people who don't know that term.
Yeah, so for many of us, we thought sundown towns were colloquial, meaning these places where Black folks couldn't be after dark. But in this situation, this particular sundown town, Fitzgerald, the white men of the community actually came together to vote to make sure Black folks didn't have a proper place in the community and couldn't be there at certain times. And the newspapers' contemporaneous accounts of what happened in this town, they said that Fitzgerald handled the Negro problem the way no other city in America could. And so this is where my grandmother's 12-year-old brother, Cornelius, was shot and killed. And then my family joins the Great Migration, joining millions of other Black folks, fleeing the South for better opportunities in the North, in Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all across the North, landing in Philadelphia first and then South Jersey. And then in 1951, another of my grandmother's brothers was shot and killed by a state trooper under mysterious circumstances. And so to think that in the course of just a couple of decades, my great-grandparents lost two sons, one in the Jim Crow South, one in the North. But then still 20 years after that, in 1976, as I mentioned, my grandfather was murdered. So my grandparents had an apartment in Camden, New Jersey, and a man came to rent the apartment and left a deposit for $160. He disappeared for many weeks. When he came back wanting his money back, my grandfather told him that it was non-refundable and that he could see him in court. And they had a court date set. And instead of going to court, that man came back and shot and killed my grandfather. And so that violence, that murder, cascaded through my family. As my mother described it, it's almost as if you have a limb shorn off your body. And for the rest of your life, you're trying to adapt and cope. And I think about my own grandmother who lost two brothers and a husband to murder. And then to think that we think about these connections to the violence that we carry within us, the stuff that we inherit, the fact that I exist because of an act of gun violence, because my grandparents met in New Jersey. And so it was the killing of my great uncle Cornelius that sent us into the migration, and that my grandparents eventually met. It's just all these ties that bind me to the violence, but also the pushing forward through the trauma.
I'm trying to relive with you how it felt when you learned all this and you had to take all this in. That can you even describe that?
There have been many moments where I had to sit back and just exhale. But there was a moment when I discovered the death certificate for Cornelius.
Cornelius, the 12-year-old, I was going to ask you about that. So tell us about that. Tell us about the death certificate. You have a copy of it in the book.
That's right. And it was so striking in the mundanity of it all. It said, age 12, cause of death, gunshot wounds. And I couldn't help but think about young Tamir Rice, who was 12-year-old, shot in Cleveland, Ohio, and his chubby face, and thinking about Cornelius's face and how those words, age 12, cause of death, gunshot wounds, should never be in proximity to each other. And what that is like, where my own daughter is 13 years old now. And imagine your child being gunned down. And there was no law enforcement response, no investigation. There was just nothing, because it wasn't shocking for a Black boy at that time to be shot and killed. So it was one of many moments where I had to reckon with what my people have had to harbor all these years.
I have to wonder, though, did that not weigh on you reporting all this?
I'll tell you what, by the time I got to reporting on the darkest parts of that history, I did have a clarity and a freedom. So I had been writing the book for 2 years with the original impetus, the idea of cause. I had my heart attack and I was forced to sit down. My body sat me down and I had to heal. So for about a year and a half, I didn't put a single word on the page, maybe 2 years. I kind of separated myself from it because in part, I attributed recounting some of these stories of my earlier career to the heart attack, right? The weight of everything, sitting neck deep in people's grief and my own. But by the time I had this clarity about what it was that almost led to my ends and almost shattered my heart, I felt even more mission driven to go back to the very beginning. Because at that point, I knew it wasn't just me. My family was one of millions of Black families who experienced the literal violence of the braided rope and the bullet in the Jim Crow South. But then the idea of, again, widening the aperture on what violence actually is, the systemic violence of being.
And what is that? When you say widening the aperture, what do you mean by that?
That it includes the literal violence and then our response to losing someone to that violence or witnessing that violence. But it also means the kind of deprivation that my family faced in the Jim Crow South of being tenant farmers, meaning they were forced to work on land that they would never own. And around settlement time, when Cornelius was killed, December, is always the time where you balance the debt, right, and credits. And without fail, Black families were always ripped off at that time. That's a form of violence to keep you in debt. And then to join the Great Migration, to land in the what was hoped to be a promised land of the North, to find jobs, certainly, less violence, certainly, but slum conditions often, right? You couldn't live in certain places. We had communities where they would draw red line around the neighborhood. You couldn't get insurance. You couldn't buy or sell because of these deeds of covenants, where some of these deeds of covenants had baked into them that if you're a white person, a homeowner, you couldn't sell to a Black person, let alone access to quality foods, right? Some of these systemic issues that I consider violence that leads to the kind of ecosystem that is ripe for gun violence still persists today. And so in grappling, it's so far beyond the bullet of what we've experienced.
One of the interesting historical facts that you talk about is how firearms were literally traded
That's right.
for African slaves,
Mm-hmm.
for people who were about to be enslaved.
Yeah.
I had never thought about that. Could you say more about that?
Discovering that was another one of those discoveries that, brought so much to bear. This idea that there is what I've described as this psychic connection, this ethereal connection to guns and Black folks. And so in my exploration, I really wanted to go back not just to the beginning of my family's exposure to gun violence, but really examine the dynamic between Black people, period, before we even got here and guns. And so for many of us, we were educated to understand that Black folks were either simply just kidnapped or they were some natural byproduct of wars that were already occurring on the continent of Africa. And then Europeans, eager to take advantage of a labor force to supply, labor needs for, the Western world, came over and made some deals. When in reality, what we see, and the abolitionists of the time were noting this, is that European powers, especially as gun technology is rising in the early 18th century, were applying regional African powers, different warring factions with guns to create instability, to create war, to create more enslaved people. And so the idea that our bodies were literally bartered for guns and that we were forced out of Africa with the muzzle of a gun at our backs and then introduced to the Western world, which would have been hellish for these enslaved Africans, and greeted by more white men with more guns to maintain what would be a hundreds-year system of servitude and violence. I think that can't be lost on us, that our literal bodies were traded for guns and we continue on to experience a specific kind of gun violence.
One of the things that you point out in the book is that African Americans disproportionately experience gun violence, particularly police violence. But I do have to say, a lot of white people in America get killed with guns.
That's right.
So I just wondered if you thought about that, if you were kind of reflected on that.
Well, certainly. And in the book, I say that, gun violence in America isn't a Black American problem alone. It's an American problem. And even though we are disproportionately disproportionately killed by police and face disproportionate gun violence, period. About 40+% of the gun deaths in this country are white. And so in some ways, not to counter the notion in the book, because I wanted to use a specific lens here, as long as gun violence in this country is considered a Black American issue, then we don't have to address any of the other broad issues, like the nature of gun death in white communities or the pipeline from legal to illegal in this country of guns. And so certainly it's an American problem. We think about the issue around school shootings and these mass shootings, which disproportionately impact white folks. And so clearly, this is just one slice, one lens to view a very, very American issue. And part of our issue with guns is that it's so connected to this sense of patriotism and, I dare say, manhood. So much of our manhood is attached to violence in this country. And so no wonder white folks as well as Black are being killed so frequently with them.
One of the points that you make in the book is because gun violence is so often associated with Blackness, often in very dehumanizing ways. I have to ask you about that. Doesn't that in some way kind of reinforce the problem that this is a Black problem and therefore it doesn't command the attention and the urgency that it would if it were seen as the national problem that it is?
Well, I think there are a couple issues here. I think because it happens so frequently and it's so disproportionate in our communities, that it's also ignored. It's treated as garden variety. It's treated as routine. It's treated as normal. And so therein, our trauma and our hurt and pain and loss, financial and otherwise, goes ignored. And so until we can point to the problem and speak to the specificity in which race has played a role in how we've experienced this gun violence, because white folks aren't dying by the gun because they're Black, but we are because we've been conditioned and cordoned off in certain communities that have been disinvested in and deprived in. So we're experiencing, that's why it's 1,000 ways to die. Long before you get to the trigger being pulled, there's a host of other issues that need to be addressed that manifest and culminate in a disproportionate gun violence. And so it's almost like policing. We're both under-policed and over-policed. It's also like media coverage. Our communities are also undercovered and sensationalized. But we can't continue to ignore the problem, and especially for Black folks. And this is a bigger question, for Black and white, actually. We have to understand that we are not the violence that we've experienced, right? There's nothing inherent or innate in us. Lest we forget in recent weeks the president's own words when he talked about the threat of occupying major cities in this country. And he said, it's not a matter of 5 years, 10 years, or 2 years. These people are born to be criminal. And so what I want to do in this book, and I want to make it clear for Black and white, but especially Black folks to understand this, that there's nothing inherently violent or wrong with us. If we want to truly understand the violence we've experienced, let's look at the machinery around us and the long continuum that got us here. And so we've experienced it a certain way. And so it requires a certain research, reporting, analyzation, and recording of it.
Trymaine Lee, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Michelle.
It's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina, widely recognized as one of America's greatest disaster relief failures. But now the Trump administration's cuts to FEMA threatened the vital reforms it made back then. Over 180 current and former employees of the Disaster Relief Agency are sounding the alarm in a letter to Congress, warning the president's actions could lead to a repeat of the Katrina catastrophe. And now several of the signatories have been put on administrative leave, including Catherine Landers, who tells Hari Srinivasan about this alongside Deanne Criswell, a former FEMA administrator.
Christian, thanks. Deanne Criswell, Catherine Landers, thank you both for joining us. Catherine, I want to start with you. You are currently an employee of FEMA, and you have put your name onto a document called the Katrina Declaration. And this is a huge list of current FEMA workers. What are you saying in this declaration?
In this declaration, we are expressing both our frustration and fear due to all of the decisions that have been made for this agency over the last few months. We are nervous that we are being dismantled and that we will be unable to help people, especially now as we have actually passed the 20th anniversary of Katrina. We are hoping that we can be given back the autonomy in order to be an effective agency and to help people before, during, and after disasters.
You know that this is a climate where an employee signing their name to a document can have repercussions. Have you faced any yet for signing this?
I guess the most apparent one is I was immediately put on administrative leave approximately 36 hours after the letter went public. This was a risk I knew was there. I did not anticipate it to happen so quickly, but that is a primary thing.
Catherine, one of the things that you point out and you and your fellow signatories point out in the Katrina Declaration is that there is now a new rule that the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem must personally approve any expense over $100,000 to try to crack down on what she deems to be wasteful spending. It said, now the administration says, since President Trump took office on January 20th, 2025, FEMA is 126% faster on average in getting federal grant funding to states and communities that request it. It is also more than 40% faster on average in getting vital assistance directly into the hands of survivors, and 100% faster in getting responders on the ground to help affected communities. You work for the agency. Has this measure, as the administration says, made FEMA more efficient, or, as the critics of this policy say, is that created a backlog or a bottleneck that has prohibited or delayed assistance from getting to people?
100% the latter. This policy has added more red tape to a system that we had in place that we knew how to work before. This system, we saw it with the Kerrville floods. It delayed key help that we needed on the ground immediately. It delayed call center contracts, which meant that people were pulled off of their normal jobs so that they could assist with callers, leading to backups of up to 7 hours. We have seen it even impact some of the most mundane but necessary aspects of our day, including delaying contract renewals for basic computer software that we need to do our everyday job. It is something that the absurdity of this policy has made itself clear over and over again. And unfortunately, we saw how devastating this policy could be with the Kerrville floods on July 4th.
Deanne, the administration has also, not just the $100,000 approval, but has also tried to make structural changes. One of the programs in question is called the BRIC program, and the Trump administration attempted to reallocate about $4 billion. A federal judge temporarily blocked that. The administration says it's another example of wasteful and ineffective FEMA program, more concerned with political agendas. For people that don't know the BRICS program, what is that?
The Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, affectionately known as the BRIC program, is actually a program that was started by President Trump in his first term. And this is funding that goes to communities before a disaster to help reduce the impact of disasters. There are many studies that are out there that show for every dollar we invest in mitigation, it saves $6 in response and recovery costs. And so I don't know how that kind of cost benefit can be determined fraudulent or wasteful use of funding. I did hear the acting administrator during his hearing say that it was funding that was being used for pet programs like bike paths and bus shelters. Well, I haven't seen exactly what he's looking at, but my immediate impression was that a bike path means that we're probably creating an area that had homes in it that can no longer be built with homes, right? Buyouts to absorb the flooding in an area, and you add a bike path into that area, right? That's creating green space so future structures can't be damaged. The goal should be to never respond or recover again because we've made smart investments to reduce impact. And so that should be the driving goal, but they've taken away the one program that can do that.
Catherine, there was a report from the Government Accountability Office that said that the number of active FEMA employees has dropped by about 10% in the first 6 months of the year. And I wonder if these reductions, perhaps some motivated by DOGE, et cetera, have had an impact on the work that you do. Just kind of give us an example, maybe your team, how it has changed over the past year.
Yeah, absolutely. The brain drain that we have witnessed over the past 8 months has been really frightening and really sad. For my team specifically, we lost two members, one of whom has been with the agency for 15 plus years. The other has been with the agency for 6 years. Both of them came with an incredible wealth of knowledge that it will take years for us to regain. Specifically for our team, we lost the ability to conduct hazard and hurricane analyses when a hurricane is bearing down on us. We take information, real-time information. We're able to feed that information to assess which communities will be hardest hit. And now, due to the various programs that have incentivized people to leave, as well as now myself being put on administrative leave, there is now one person who can make these runs, who can disseminate this information to states and territories. So I was there, I could have helped, but now I no longer am there. And we have one person who can do this.
Ms. Criswell, one of the statements of opposition outlined in this Katrina declaration is that, quote, there have now been two individuals placed in charge of FEMA who lack proper qualifications and the authority to lead this agency. And I wonder what makes these successors to your job less qualified?
Well, I think when you look at both of them, Hari, they just don't have emergency management experience. And that was one of the things that we learned from Hurricane Katrina. You had a leader that didn't have emergency management experience. And so they don't have the knowledge and the background to anticipate what the potential impacts of a severe weather event might be. Just as you heard Catherine talk about the planning that they do, when you have a leader that has that knowledge and that experience of responding to situations like that, they know the right questions to ask. They know how to interpret the data that's coming to them. Now you have a leader that doesn't have that experience, and you've also lost that institutional knowledge to try to get them up to speed. And so you really create a vacuum of capability in trying to anticipate what an impact to a community might be, so you can move resources ahead of time and make sure that they're there to support that community, to support that state, to support that local community. I'll say at least when Cameron Hamilton was there, he was trying hard to learn, and he went and talked to all of the different leaders, and he made an effort to make a difference. But we're not seeing the same thing from where I sit, right? And I'm sitting outside the agency, but from where I'm sitting, I just don't see that same effort from the current acting administrator.
Just recently, last month, the Department of Homeland Security, DN, which oversees FEMA for our audience, they put out a press release that said, for too long, disaster response has been bogged down by red tape, inefficiency, and a one-size-fits-all approach that left too many Americans waiting for help that came too late. And that, relatively speaking, to someone from the outside, seems logical. Hey, make it more efficient after a disaster to get me the aid that I need to get my community back up on its feet, right? Are there reforms that you feel that the agency needed to make?
Ari, I think the first thing that I want to point out with that statement is they're talking just about response. We've heard a lot of conversation about we need to push the responsibility for response back to state and locals. State and locals have always had the responsibility to manage response and recovery. And in my 4 years as the FEMA administrator, never once did I have a governor complain to me about the response. There are plenty of frustrations from governors and emergency management directors at the state and local level in the recovery space. There is a lot of opportunity to create efficiencies in how communities get reimbursed. I think remembering that FEMA primarily is a reimbursement agency. They provide funding to reimburse communities as they rebuild their infrastructure. And that can be delayed by a number of things. And it can sometimes just be plain oversight, like procurement regulations and environmental regulations. But sometimes it's also just asking too many questions, requests for information, asking for too much detail. Things that frustrated me during my time as the FEMA administrator. We spent a lot of time focused on improving the efficiency of the individual assistance program and making sure that it wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. The same level of effort does need to be given and analysis to the public assistance program, and how do we make those same types of efficiencies better, give the states and the locals more ability to have say in how the recovery is going to be rebuilt without unnecessary bureaucracy.
Deanna, I'm old enough to have covered Katrina on the ground. And I think for me personally, that was kind of a moment where I watched the trust in the institution that is FEMA and the government's response really erode significantly. And I wonder, even now, there are people who have concerns about FEMA's response to, say, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017 or Hurricane Ida. But I wonder if this decrease in trust that we have ends up fueling what the administration wants in its major reforms.
Well, I think one of the things, Hari, that's really important is, there's still so many people that have vivid memories of Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. And you and I both can still remember all of the challenges that happened at all levels, federal, state, and local level. And everybody has a role to play. There have been tremendous improvements since Katrina over the last 20 years that we've talked about. But I think for me, it feels like with the increase in the ability to spread information on social media, that it creates greater opportunity to feed that mistrust, whether it's appropriate or not. I mean, I go back to Hurricane Helene. I led the effort for Hurricane Helene. I think 6 states initially, I think 8 states, in the end had declarations. I was on the ground before Helene made landfall in North Carolina. Yet you had a little bit of commentary that was not accurate, was proven to be inaccurate, but it spread like wildfire on social media and it created this mistrust. But that mistrust was all outside of the area. When I talked to the governor, when I talked to the county sheriffs, when I talked to the local mayors, they were all grateful for everything that we were doing. But I think it all boils down to a lack of understanding of what FEMA's role really is in response, right? FEMA they're not the firefighters. They're not the EMTs. They're not the law enforcement professionals. Yes, they can send in search and rescue capability to help augment those amazing first responders that are taking care of their communities. But essentially, they only come in to provide support that the state or the local doesn't have. And when you're stabilizing that incident, it could be like the Army Corps of Engineers that's on the ground helping to assess the water treatment facility or damage to bridges and the security or the stability of those bridges. It can be Health and Human Services that's trying to assess, the impact to hospitals or setting up mobile health teams. That's all FEMA.
Catherine, we should note in the letter that was informing you that you were put on administrative leave with pay, it said, quote, "Your placement on administrative leave is not a disciplinary action." And I'm wondering whether you are concerned, along with the other FEMA current employees, that speaking with us right now could shift your status from administrative leave to just being fired.
Yeah, absolutely. This, as was my decision to put my name publicly on the letter, it was a calculated decision. It was a risk that I knew existed. But I think it is really important that we can listen to the people within FEMA right now to give a voice to the employees that are being steamrolled over by this administration. And I am nervous, but I am okay with it. I'm okay with the risk, and I'm happy to be taking it.
For the record, we reached out to FEMA for comment about both the Katrina declaration and, Catherine, your case in specific. And as we speak, they haven't yet responded. Deanna, I have kind of a 30,000-foot question for you. On his first trip in his second term to disaster sites in California and Louisiana, President Trump said, quote, "I'll also be signing an executive order to begin the process of fundamentally reforming and overhauling FEMA, or maybe getting rid of FEMA. I think, frankly, FEMA's not good." I guess the question for my audience is, if there was no federal emergency response agency, what would happen in another Katrina-like disaster?
I think it would be even worse than Katrina, because you can't expect state and local jurisdictions to replicate all of the capability that the federal government can bring, right? We're talking about economies of scale here. When FEMA has several distribution centers that are strategically placed around the country that then can move those resources like food and water and tarps and infant and toddler kits, move them closer to the impacted area, right? You move them as the need arises. To expect state and local jurisdictions to represent or recreate all of that capability, one is a really poor use of taxpayer dollars, and it's just not efficient. And my fear would be that they're not going to be able to replicate that level of capability individually in each state. Some states might be able to, states that have a lot of disasters and have a lot of funding, like Texas and Florida, like they could probably get close. But other states that just have disasters infrequently, they're not going to be able to create that. And so I think when you see a big event happen and you don't have those kind of federal resources, 28 urban search and rescue teams that are strategically placed across the U.S., which are trained and funded by FEMA, but they're local first responders, right? When Texas happened, they brought in Texas Task Force One. They're funded and trained by FEMA. All of that goes away. And so I think we just see a less capable nation, and we will see more vulnerable communities not get the necessary help that they need and they deserve.
Catherine Landers is a geospatial risk analyst at FEMA who is currently on administrative leave. And Deanne Criswell was the former administrator of FEMA. Thank you both for joining us.
Next, we turn to the United States, where the Trump administration is creating a task force to identify federal lands suitable for building affordable homes. Now, the initiative marks a first step by the Trump White House to address one of the worst housing shortages in decades. That shortage is part of the focus of the new book, Abundance. Co-authors Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson join Walter Isaacson to discuss how the crises we see today can be traced back to the regulatory policies of previous generations.
Thank you, Paula and Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter. Great to be here.
So, Derek, a few years ago, you coined the words the abundance agenda, and now this book sort of builds on that. Tell me what you meant by the abundance agenda.
This is January 2022. And I was standing in line in Washington, D.C. in the frigid air, waiting on a COVID test, which at the time were being rationed during the Omicron outbreak. And I thought to myself, it's kind of crazy that we are now 2 years into a pandemic and we don't have enough COVID tests. And I was thinking about the experience of the pandemic. I thought it wasn't just that we don't have enough COVID tests. We don't or haven't had enough COVID vaccines. And before that, there was a scarcity of PPE for hospital workers. The pandemic, I thought, was really just this experience of one shortage after another. And as I zoomed out from the experience of the pandemic, I thought, it's not just this pandemic alone. It's really America in the 21st century that has dealt with one crisis of scarcity after another. There aren't enough homes, and as a result, affordability is a major crisis in American cities. We don't have enough clean energy construction in this country or many other countries, and that's one of the reasons why climate change has been so difficult to take down. And as I thought about all of the scarcities that have defined this modern age, I thought, well, what America needs most is the exact opposite. Not a reality of scarcity, but an agenda of abundance. And I thought this abundance agenda could take on housing to create an abundance of housing. It could take on clean energy. But far beyond that, you could look at all sorts of other blockages and bottlenecks in the economy, whether it's policies that limit the number of doctors we have or policies that make it harder for scientists to do their best work. We need to think about what an agenda for true American abundance would look like. And then yada, 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 we have a book.
So, Ezra, you've written a lot about this when it comes to housing, which is the core of this book in many ways. Really interesting part, including the shocking statistic that in the 1950s, housing was about twice as much as your annual salary. Now it'd be 6 times as much. Why is that?
Because in the places people want to live, we stop building homes. I mean, it's really that simple. I'm a Californian. I grew up in California. I went to public university in California, then lived in DC for 13, 14 years and moved back to California, which is where I lived during a lot of the writing of this book. And Derek's experience of the pandemic has sort of been my experience of California. I love my home state. It is on the technological frontier. It is the cultural frontier. It is beautiful. So why is it losing hundreds of thousands of people every year to Texas, to Arizona, to Colorado, to Florida? And the answer is the working class can't afford to live there, right? These families are my friends, right? I was in San Francisco watching people have kids and have to move away because they couldn't afford a home in the city that often they did essential jobs to protect or to serve. And parts of the book that we wrote are futuristic. Parts of them are about how we pull the inventions we want in the future forward into the present. Those are things that we don't yet know how to build. But there's no technical problem around building apartment buildings. The question of how to construct a house is solved. What is the issue here is politics, is process, is the ability to get people to say yes, and frankly, the process where you have to have so many people say yes along the way. And you've been looking at other problems in California. Why are we not going to hit our clean energy targets? Well, we've made it too hard to build clean energy. So Texas, which does not love clean energy the way California does, is building more clean energy than California is. What happened to high-speed rail? Sort of the same story. And at some point, you begin to realize what you have in a lot of big liberal states, it is true for New York, true for Illinois, true for others, is we have not focused as liberals on creating the supply of the things people need most.
You know, Derek, as you just said, as liberals, and this book is written, both of you consider yourselves sort of liberal, moderate Democrats, but it's largely pushes back at the Democratic Party for being engaged in process, regulation. How much of the problem, let's stick with housing, comes from regulations and rules and everything and NIMBYism and zoning?
Something's happened to the identity of liberalism in this country. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, the New Deal era, we built and built and built, and it was a Democrat, FDR, that got us kickstarted on this habit of building. We built houses and roads. We built transmission lines and electricity. We built dams. We built canals. We built it all. And something happened, I think, to the identity of liberalism in the 1960s and 1970s, where we decided that the key to being a good liberal was being good at the politics of blocking rather than the politics of building. And there were lots of good reasons for this shift. The environmental situation in the 1950s America was horrendous. I mean, people were waking up to waters that were disgusting and air that was choked with smog. And so we made it harder for states and companies to change the physical world. But the medicine of the 20th century that we administered to this country has become the disease of the 21st century. It's simply become too difficult to build in this country. And too often, as we look in the mirror, we see that it is liberals who are responsible for this.
Ezra, why is that liberals did that?
The parties right now, the coalitions, have mirror image problems of each other. The personality type of the right is autocratic, and the personality type of the left is bureaucratic. Liberals are the rule followers, or the people who listen to the lawyers, right? Elon Musk does not listen to the lawyers, to put it gently. In a way, both sides could use a little bit more of what the other one has in excess. Liberals could use a little bit more of a knock it down energy, and certainly the right could use a bit more respect for systems, for institutions, for laws. This is not just a kind of searing act of self-criticism for no reason. Our goals are liberal ones. We've been talking about housing, but decarbonization is a huge part of the book. And one of the reasons it makes sense to aim that conversation at liberals is that they share our goals. We are liberals. We want to decarbonize. When the right builds fossil fuels at a torrid pace, when Donald Trump gets up there, as he has, and tries to destroy the solar and wind industries, which is what he is doing, he just doesn't share our goals. He's not trying to build the world we're trying to build. So there's a second problem, which is simply that our goals are liberal. And so if liberal states are not achieving those goals, like, that's an issue. It was true that for a while, as we were running through the natural space of this country, the question of how to block thoughtless development from happening was a very pressing question. We had functionally no muscle for doing that. Now, climate change inverts that. To conserve anything of the climate we've known for the entirety of human civilization, we have to build clean energy infrastructure at a torrid pace. And so now all of a sudden, to preserve the environment, instead of stopping things from happening, you need to make things happen very quickly. That requires new laws, it requires new ideas, it requires a new culture.
So, Derek, on the environmental issue, you in the book talk about the fact that the way the progressives and liberals tend to approach it is stop growth, stop growth. That seems to be antithetical to an abundance agenda. What should they be doing instead?
We need to reinvent what environmentalism means to face the challenges of the 2020s and not the 1960s. And the problems of today are that we cannot continue to grow by burning stuff we find in the ground. We have to use solar and wind and geothermal and, yes, even nuclear power to have a modern economy that people enjoy without destroying the biosphere. That means having a new relationship to building in the physical world and defining liberalism as what can you build and not what can you block.
So, Ezra, if you look at what President Biden did for clean energy and the infrastructure, there were many things, but one of them was to try to have electric vehicle charging stations across this country. I'll tell a tale about one of my Tulane students who ended up going into city government. He was so proud he was going to help build those charging stations in Louisiana because it's a state thing. And yet, by the end of it, they had built zero because every time he came up with a plan, they said, well, this plan doesn't fit our equity matrix, or it doesn't fit our labor standards, or it doesn't fit this. And so zero got built. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's absolutely what I'm talking about. There's another example like that, which is that in the infrastructure bill, a huge amount of the money in that bill, more than $40 billion, was earmarked for rural broadband. It's a great idea. That was passed in, I forget if it's late 2021 or early 2022. Either way, by the end of 2024, the number of people it had hooked up to broadband was approximately 0 people. You then wonder, why didn't they win? Right? You talk to the Biden people. I've spoken to them many, many times. I know you both have too. And they're very, very, very proud of the decade of infrastructure investment that they set off with the CHIPS Act, with the infrastructure bill, with the IRA. And I think in a way they're confused about why that didn't have more political upside for them. But one reason, maybe not the only, is that people didn't feel it. The money didn't move fast enough. Having, getting $42 billion for broadband isn't all that important if people don't get broadband. And a lot of the book is about this dynamic in which Democrats will pass a big bill. And it is sometimes at the national level, right? Like the Inflation Reduction Act, or it's sometimes at the state or local level. Like I report in some detail on Los Angeles's efforts to raise money to build affordable housing. And then you look at how it's implemented. And it is the amount of complexity layered onto it is astonishing. And a lot of these intentions are well-meaning. The equity intentions are well-meaning. The environmental things you're building into it are good. But I was talking to somebody who builds affordable housing. And my God, have they been slow in doing that and using public money in Los Angeles? And she was saying that when she tries to build it, and she's housing people who live in tents under the freeway, she has to go back to the planning board. And they're like, well, you need a higher quality air filtration system because this development will be near a freeway. Higher quality, by the way, than a private development would have. And that's fine, but it is delaying housing when the alternative is people living in no house at all with no filtration system under an overpass underneath the freeway. Liberals should be much angrier about this than conservatives, right? This is a part of modern politics that upsets me. For conservatives, it's fine when government fails. They kind of want it to fail. That proves their point. Liberals should not be excusing it when it fails. They should be fixing it when it fails. They should be making sure it doesn't happen again. And that's what I don't see. That's, I think, the cultural change that needs to happen here.
Let me say that, Derek, there's been such a backlash that we now have, what Trump is doing, what Elon Musk is doing in government. But it's partly a backlash because, as Ezra just said, they were supposed to build broadband internet access and build zero. Whereas Musk and Starlink have put up 1 million since then, likewise put up, hundreds of thousands of chargers. Do you think this is what's causing this backlash that has led to people like Trump and Musk and others wanting to blow up the regulations?
Let's make no mistake. We have in this country a right-wing movement that is trying to destroy government, and not just destroy it to take it over, to purge it of all sources of potential pushback and ideological disagreement, right? Not a coincidence that we're turning over our telecom policy to Elon Musk himself, or that Trump is, getting out into the front lawn of the White House in order to basically make an advertisement for Tesla, or Tesla, as he calls it. We have a government right now which is defining or combining the worst parts of kleptocracy and kakistocracy, government by theft and government of the worst people. All that is to say, We need an opposition movement in this country that is popular and strong and competent. And it's a problem right now that Democrats and the left are unpopular and weak and often not competent in the places that they govern. To elaborate on Ezra's point, it's been a terrible political mistake to measure success in dollars authorized rather than things accomplished. That's how you get California authorizing $33 billion to build a high-speed rail system that doesn't exist. It's how you get a story of a $1.7 million toilet. Yes, $1.7 million public toilet built in San Francisco because the city has such procedural kludge. That's how New York City has the most expensive mile of subway construction in the world. It's how you get the Chicago mayor bragging on Twitter that they spent $11 billion to build 10,000 affordable housing units, coming out to $1.1 million per affordable housing unit. This is the record of a movement that has forgotten to judge political success by outcomes and instead has judged political success by how much money can we spend.
Boy, let me just ask you that, Derek. Why is there no Democratic city mayor who's making the city work?
Well, there are Democratic city mayors making the city work. I mean, there are Democratic city mayors, for example, in the state of North Carolina, in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area, which is adding more residents than almost any metro in the country. That's where I'm living for this year. There are mayors who are making things work. It's happening. And many mayors and many governors are outcome-oriented. Jared Polis from Colorado is a great example of a governor, a Democratic governor, who I think is thinking in a very forward-looking way about the need for housing abundance. How do we bring down regulations? And also, how do we make it easier technologically to put up housing? Because if you can put up housing for cheap, then that reduces the price that people have to pay to live in those units. There are people on our side. There are YIMBYs who are younger progressives. There are people who are...
Explain what a YIMBY is real quick.
Yeah, there are people who are defining themselves, I think, as abundance progressives. There's people on our side, but we're trying to enlarge this movement.
I would add to that, the YIMBYs are the yes in my backyard folks, right? The YIMBYs have their center in San Francisco and California for all the intellectual victories and even statutes passed, bills passed, have not begun building more housing. This is very hard to do. Everybody wants to say, I passed a big bill on affordable housing. Saying I went into the guts of the processes and I closed down a bunch of ways people in the community could come out and voice their objection to somebody building an apartment building down the block, that's a lot less popular. It's a harder fight. You often don't have the power to do it. Maybe the mayor wants to do it, but the board of supervisors doesn't want to do it. You see this all over, right? Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, he knows perfectly well what a problem the housing crisis is, both for California and for any presidential ambitions he might harbor. He has signed bill after bill after bill after bill. But the coalitional dynamics of this aren't easy. And that's why it does require, I think, some long, aggressive ideological change, because nobody wants to focus on process. Right? Nobody wants to hear about it. You don't win elections by saying, well, I've reconstructed the overlapping jurisdictional authorities that created 14 veto points in how we built a public restroom. It makes people in the agencies mad. They get mad at you. They leak things into the press. You have to see it as enough of a crisis to break some eggs. And again, I am, Lord knows, no fan of what DOGE is doing. But I do hope Democrats take one thing from it, which is that there's a lot that they have treated as inviolable in the way government works. A lot of rules, regulations, interagency processes, notes from their lawyers that weren't exactly laws. They were just sort of guidance. And they treated all of it as something that was a hard boundary. You just couldn't do anything about it. I mean, there is a dimension where I think liberals stop. Too many Democrats stop at the first sign of internal bureaucratic resistance. They treat the structure of government as too settled. The Republicans right now are treating it as completely unsettled, and they are trying to unmake it. They are trying to destroy it. I do not want American politics trapped between a party that will not make government work and a party that wants to make government fail. We are going to need, after the sort of institutional defenders that the Democrats became, the institutional arsonists the Republicans became, we're going to need some kind of synthesis, a party, a coalition, a movement that insists on making government work, not because it hates government, not because it doesn't want government to do big things, but precisely because it cares about government and it does want government to do big things.
Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We turn now to a topic everyone is talking about, the dangers and potential of artificial intelligence. This rapidly advancing technology is raising concerns around the world and is already becoming an unavoidable part of modern life. So, do we trust it, and how is it impacting our relationships? Well, that's the question our next guests are examining. Yasmin Green is the CEO of Jigsaw, a program supporting emerging technologies at Google, and anthropologist Gillian Tett is the head of King's College, Cambridge. They join Walter Isaacson to discuss their recent piece for Foreign Affairs exploring how AI represents a drastic change in human connection.
Thank you, Biana and Yasmin Green and Gillian Tett. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
The two of you have just written a piece in Foreign Affairs about trust and the AI revolution. Let me start with you, Yasmin, with a very basic question. Are AI chatbots replacing search? You work at Jigsaw, which is a unit of Google, so you're probably best placed to answer that.
Well, the paper actually looks at the evolution of trust over time, starting with when we lived in small societies. We talk about eye-level trust. As we started to settle down and live in larger societies, we talk about the evolution of vertical trust in institutions. The internet introduced this kind of new trust phenomenon that we call distributed trust. And then we talk about, well, what's happening now in this new era of AI and eventually AGI. And we're kind of exploring how, well, it's often said that trust, we're in a trustless world. We're post-trust. Your trust is evaporated. And Gillian and I have really explored another possibility, which is that trust has migrated. And we're looking to new trust norms.
And is this something specific with AI and large language models, or is this true for the whole internet phenomenon at the moment?
Yeah, so that third trust era, the distributed trust, that was really what we saw with social media and the internet, sometimes called Web 2.0. This idea that you would get into a cab with a complete stranger, get into a car with a complete stranger, or go and rent accommodation from someone you've never met, or trade with people that you don't know. That was all enabled by the internet. This idea that platforms enabled us to have some trust. Like, what is trust in that in that context? It is feeling that belief in the reliability of something, whether it's trade or transport, etc. So we saw something really that transformed who and how we trust with the internet. And what we explore in the piece is how this AI era, this era of like chatbots that we can talk to, that talk back to us, that are available 24/7, that are personalized, that are private, that really is ushering in a new trust era beyond that of the internet.
Yasmin has just talked about, Gillian, this notion of peer-to-peer trust that we see in Airbnb and Uber. She mentioned those things. Tell me how distributed trust works anthropologically.
Well, I'm an anthropologist by training, and the key point is this. People know that anthropologists study culture. And they sometimes think that culture is a bit like a Tupperware box, in that it's sealed and static, and you can stack up different cultures on top of each other in a hierarchy of value, and of course assume that your own culture is the most valuable. But anthropologists actually have a different vision of culture, which is that it's more like a river that's slow moving and constantly changing with new streams coming in. And that applies to the issue of, say, you mentioned earlier about search versus bots. I mean, the reality is that our digital culture is in constant flux. And right now, the question of who we trust is also in flux. And traditionally, anthropologists assumed that there were two axes of trust that glued societies together. Either face-to-face trust, if you like, eyeball-to-eyeball peer group trust, or when groups got really big, you had to trust in vertical axes, in leaders and institutions, because you couldn't eyeball everybody. But now, digital links are essentially creating a whole new type of trust, which is peer-to-peer trust on a massive scale that's not bounded by geographical proximity anymore. And that's really at the heart of what we're arguing, that our culture, our digital culture, is slowly evolving like a river. And right now, that horizontal trust, distributed trust, is incredibly important to think about.
But when you talk about peer-to-peer trust, you're talking about interpersonal. In other words, human beings distributing trust. How is that changed by AI in the equation?
Well, here's the key issue that, as I say, distributed trust has emerged as a really important platform, really since the internet took hold. And that's underpinned things like the rise of Airbnb or Uber or many other tools that we use today. But that doesn't stay still either. So introducing AI into this equation is creating a new forms of trust, where essentially you can have AI acting, as I say, like the 4 M's. You can have them. Our vision of AI has historically been that as a master, it's coming to us from a vertical axis, bossing us around and telling us what to do. Or you can have AI as a kind of mate, one of our gang, one of our friends. Or you can have AI as a mirror to ourselves. Or you can have AI as a moderator, where essentially they're using all of the digital tools available to moderate conversations between human beings. And they can all play a role today. So it's not just a question of whether or not we trust AI. It's really about, do we trust the idea that AI tools might actually make it easier for humans to trust other humans, or at least to interact with them in a way that could build trust?
Now, Yasmin, I think one of the main outlets from what I read is TikTok, of course. We all use it, but Gen Z uses it probably more than the rest of us. Explain how that changes things.
If a Gen Z consistently reads certain news outlets, it's because they believe in individual journalists, as opposed to they're following the individual journalist as opposed to the brand of the institution of the media outlet. And so that kind of helps you understand the rise of newsy social media influencers, news influencers who are delivering their interpretation of the news. It's not, investigative reporting. It's really opinion, and off the back of actually the investigative reporting of news institutions. But the reason that social signal matters so much to Gen Z is that they believe in people who look and sound like them. Influencers that go viral on social media, they speak to you like we're in a one-on-one conversation with words you understand, with references you understand, and there's a trust, there's an authenticity. It's almost like the tension between authority and authenticity, that authority used to trump everything in a vertical trust world with institutions, and increasingly, especially Gen Z, really subscribe to authenticity as a reason to trust.
So, Julian, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that, which is normally when I try to get news or information, I do a query or a search query or a chatbot prompt that I want to know the truth. I'm a truth-seeking query. But Yasmin seems to say that in the study of Gen Z, they're looking for more affirmation, social affirmation, rather than just pure truth-seeking.
Well, you're absolutely right, Walter. I think anyone of our generation tends to operate in the same way that you're talking, which is basically to look to experts or expert sources for validation of our ideas. Now, one of the key precepts of anthropology is that you cannot ever assume that the entire world looks at the world in the same way that you do. And although we're all hardwired to assume that the ideas we grew up with are normal, unchanging, and correct, and everyone else should look at the world like we do, thinking that is a complete fallacy in today's world, not just because we live in an age of globalization, but because different generations have different approaches. So the reality is that Gen Z doesn't trust experts and institutions in the way that you and I were reared to do, which is horrifying to anyone who's an elite person in an institution or of our generation. But the reality is there's good and bad things about what's going on. The good thing is it's potentially very empowering. It's potentially in some ways more democratic, and you can potentially get a much wider range of voices in this type of debate. The bad thing is it can make it a very chaotic cacophony of noises, very hard to have serious conversations about policy trade-offs. And of course, you can have both a scope for a tremendous amount of attention deficit disorder, but also tremendous amount of misinformation in some contexts. That's the dangers. And neither Yasmin nor I are in any way sugarcoating what's going on or denying any of the dangers that are associated with the explosion of AI bots and the risk that trust gets abused. And we're both really strongly arguing for a sensible conversation to mitigate those dangers. But, there are upsides too to the way that Gen Z is approaching this that frankly we can all learn from. And whether you love or hate it, the reality is this shift is occurring and you cannot afford to ignore it.
Does this shift lead to more conspiracy theories, Yasmin?
Yeah. There's a paper that we talk about in our own essay that was done by researchers at MIT and elsewhere. So it's called, you can go and find it online. It's called DebunkBot. And they used LLM. So now let's talk about what's powerful about this LLM moment and where's the promise that we should be investing in as we try to make the LLM era, work for us and as individuals and as society. And they recruited for conspiracy theorists and they gave them some back and forth interactions with a chatbot. And they found that after just 2 or 3 back and forths, people on average recorded having 20% less strong beliefs in conspiracy theories, and that those effects endured over months. And the interesting thing, so people would explain why they believed in chemtrails. I can see the exhaust of the plane and I know the government engages in mind control. And then the LLM went back and forth and talked about, well, that's, it's called contrails, it's condensation, and just engaged with them. The quotes were so powerful about people's experience during the studies, where they said, well, I've never had such a, helpful conversation where someone's explained it to me so well. And that's because people have, we associate that others have an agenda when they're trying to communicate with us. This is like some of the, I think, prejudice against experts or institutions, and that they felt the chatbot was neutral. They felt the chatbot was a safe space for them to really have, back and forth engagement. What we talk about in our paper is some of the promise there, like how can we use chatbots? One of the examples, which is from the University of Bingham, some academics who we're supporting at Jigsaw, is they're using AI to help people communicate who otherwise disagree. So you think, one of the most incredible uses of AI, that it's so incredible and so prevalent we hardly refer to it as AI anymore, is language translation. Google Translate helps, you can speak to anyone in the world despite not knowing the same language. Well, that's not really the cause of most conflict. Is not that we don't speak the same language. It's actually that we don't have the same worldview. The reason that dialogue breaks down is that I don't know where you're coming from, and I can't explain to you where I'm coming from in a way that lands. So this study is looking at the power of LLMs to enable people not to do language translation, but social language translation. Can your viewpoint be explained to me in values that I understand, and back and forth?
Well, wait. Give me a concrete example of that, like what you did in Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Okay. Well, Bowling Green is our latest project at Jigsaw directly, where we used LLMs to bring the entire... So Bowling Green is the fastest growing town in the amazing state of Kentucky, doubling in size over the next 20 years. Their judge executive, essentially the mayor, Doug Gorman, so realized that this change was really going to upend society if he didn't bring people together to help them chart their future. But there is no way to bring 100,000 people together and have a single conversation, right? The internet actually didn't deliver that for us. Like, social media didn't help us have very productive, large conversations. So we worked with Doug Gorman, Innovation Engine, and local leaders in Kentucky to basically do an AI-enabled town hall. So previously, when they had done town halls in Bowling Green, Kentucky, they had about 8 or 9 people attend. When we worked with them to invite anyone to participate in a virtual town hall, they had 8,000 people, so 1,000 times the participation, 1 million opinions expressed, thousands of policy proposals, and we used AI to help the judge executive make sense of it all. And the thing that was so stunning, other than the themes of the things they wanted, was that for more than half of the policy proposals, there was near universal agreement. So it's like we can, I think we're in this world where we felt that social media hasn't really served us in bringing us together as people. But I think the LLM era holds promise to do that.
Jillian, the whole notion of social media, the digital revolution, LLMs, was that it was going to connect us. It was going to make us more united. That clearly didn't work. From an anthropological perspective, what causes divisiveness, and is that built into these technologies or even the business and algorithms these technology use?
Well, that is such a great question, because I spent a lot of time talking to the founders of Twitter. And when they originally created Twitter, they imagined it as being a bit like a sort of cyber bar where everyone just kind of bumped into everyone else and hung together as a great big happy mass. And one of the reasons they actually had that little bird, Twitter, on Twitter was because they imagined everyone flocking together in a great big happy group, sort of singing Kumbaya. And the reality is that the minute that Twitter became so popular that you had vast numbers on the platform, you began to have massive fragmentation, which is really about this fundamental human urge to hang together with people who look like you and to choose who to hang with. Now, in the real world, you can't do that most of the time because you're essentially constrained by geography, your workplace, your family. Your identity is kind of handed to you, and so is your social group. But the crucial thing to understand about the internet is that when we go online, we have, for the first time in history, the ability to fashion identity exactly as we want and to customize, to pick and mix exactly who we want to hang with and how we present ourselves. It's the ultimate pick and mix tool, if you like. And people tend to pick and mix themselves into tribes that reflect the real world tribalism, but actually intensify it because of this customization.
Well, wait. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's both. Like all innovations have a good side and a bad side, whether you're talking about electricity, nuclear power, anything else. And the good thing is it feels empowering. You can find your peeps across a really wide geographical area. So people in the past who might have felt quite isolated because they were the only person in their village who was like them can suddenly feel a sense of solidarity. The bad side is that people start self-selecting into tribal groups. And because big tech is able to create an architecture that essentially sends you down rabbit holes of your own choosing, that has reinforced the tribalism dramatically. So what we're trying to say is we're not sugarcoating the dangers of what's going on whatsoever. We all know about that. You know, we've all read Jonathan Haidt's book on the anxious generation, all the other things out there pointing the dangers. And AI brings dangers. That's definitely out there. But there's another side of it, which is that, as Yasmin says, AI bots may be more neutral in a world of human tribalism than we realize. And that might start to have really interesting positive benefits if we master our use of AI and the bots rather than are mastered by it. And maybe one way to start is, instead of saying artificial intelligence, which sounds like something which is imposed on us, often from the top, we start talking about augmented intelligence or accelerated intelligence, which gives the idea that we as humans can use these tools for both a sense of agency and possibly even for good, to unleash the angels of our better nature, if you like, rather than the demons that we've had so visibly on display in recent years.
Yasmin Green, Jillian Tett, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers.
260 million. That's how many Americans are predicted to be either overweight or obese by 2050. It's a dire warning from medical experts, but can drugs like Ozempic offer a way out? Or does a lack of regulation mean they could cause more harm than good? Dr. David Kessler is a former FDA commissioner who was instrumental in enacting tough tobacco regulations under President Clinton and later led President Biden's COVID response. He joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss his new book on the obesity crisis.
Bianna, thanks. Dr. David Kessler, thanks so much for joining us. Your new book is titled Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. And you're looking really kind of a little bit more holistically at nutrition and weight loss. And I guess, why did you feel the need to write this book right now?
You know, the American body is ill. Only about 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And there's a real opportunity to reclaim our health. That's why I wrote the book.
I mean, how much of the population is suffering in these different ways? I mean, our statistics say that we're talking, as of 2023, 40% of American adults over the age of 20 are considered obese. How did we get to this point? I mean, is it the fact that ultra-processed foods have been introduced to diet, how long they've been there, how culturally accepted they are?
Let's understand one thing. This is not about weight. It's not how big you are or small you are. To me, it's about health. The question is, really about toxic fat, sick fat. It's the fat in our midsection. It's the fat that gets into our liver, into our pancreas, into layers of our heart that cause many of the chronic diseases: cardiac, kidney, metabolic, certain forms of cancer, and possibly even neurodegenerative diseases. So it's toxic fat. This is not about weight.
Can you explain a little bit medically what's happening with that kind of belly fat or deep fat, visceral fat, whatever it's called? What is it actually doing? How is it kind of actively working against my health, more than just the fact that, oh, I have a few pounds now overall spread out from my body? What's the danger of it being right here in my midsection?
This midsection fat, as you just referred to it, this toxic fat, it's different than some of the fat that's under our skin and our arms and in our legs. This fat, these fat cells have a hard time because of the just amount of calories we're taking in, holding on to all the lipids, to all the fat. So they leak these molecules. They leak certain pro-inflammatory molecules, and those molecules in that fat, are getting into our vital organs. Doctors, whether it's cardiologists, nephrologists, neurologists, oncologists, we're all waking up to the fact that this toxic fat getting into our vital organs, that our organs are bathed in this inflammatory soup that these cells are leaking out. It's really causing metabolic chaos in our bodies. This beer belly, we always, became part of the culture. Thought it was cool. Men were strong. It's really killing us.
If you look at this as an addictive set of substances that are causing the worst of this midsection and toxic fat, should we be looking at this as something that's able to change our brain chemistry?
I think we can all relate to the experience. Food is very powerful. Whether it's neurochemistry or the neurocircuits, I think we need to rethink how we talk about addiction. Addiction was always something, that was the weak, the downtrodden. In fact, these addictive circuits are part of all of us. Thousands of years ago, our brains evolved to deal with an environment of scarcity. The brains that could focus our attention on finding this energy dense food in an environment of scarcity. That was great for survival. It's not that our brains today are not working well or something's broken about them. They're working only too well because we've changed this food environment to put these energy dense foods. Through 24/7, we're exposed to it. There are certain elements of addiction. There's something called cue-induced wanting. What's a cue? It could be the time of day. It could be I passed a certain store. It could be a smell. I wasn't even thinking about it, but my brain unconsciously gets cued. And based on past learning and past memory, that cue stimulates this wanting. And all of a sudden I have thoughts, maybe I should go into that store. Maybe I should have that food. And until you, actually consume it, those thoughts stay with you. If you have the food available 24/7, you don't even feel the pull, of these. But when you try to resist, I would always lose weight. I've gained and lost my body weight multiple times. I would lose the weight. I was done, I thought, and I would always gain it back. One of the things about addiction, is there's relapse. And when you're dealing with food, it's really about that regaining food. Yes, there's metabolic adaptation, but these reward circuits, they're just part of all of us.
So if this is an addictive substance and it's engineered to be more so, what's the role of the government here? Should this industry be regulated more closely? We're doing it for alcohol and for tobacco.
I had the privilege, of being part of the team that, as you said, did the investigation into tobacco. No doubt that there are certain tools the government has that can change our relationship with these addictive substances. But what really worked in tobacco? It was one of the great public health successes, over the last 100 years. At the turn of the previous century, what the tobacco companies did was, they hired the psychoanalyst A.A. Brill to come up, with the phrase, symbols of liberty, torches of freedom. There was the march down Fifth Avenue for emancipation. They made cigarettes into something that was sexy, adventuresome, glamorous. There was the Marlboro man. They made it positively valenced. And what happens when something's positively valenced and it's addictive? You want it. What did we do over the last 50, 75 years? Right? We changed the valence. We changed the tobacco. There was this critical perceptual shift from something I wanted, that was my friend, to something that I didn't want. There was a deadly, disgusting product. It was my enemy. So how we perceive these foods, are these foods really satisfying me? What are they doing to my body? Do I really want them? I think, yes, there's government tools that you can use, but we really have to change how we see these foods.
Let's turn our conversation a little bit to GLP-1 drugs. And you write really in a fantastic kind of personal voice about your personal journey with these drugs. How do the sort of semaglutides, the tirzepatides, how do they work? And what has been your experience with them?
What they do is, the scientific term is, they delay gastric emptying. That just simply says that food stays in your stomach longer. And we all have experienced that. We get the flu. Our GI tract doesn't move as much. Food stays in our stomach. And how do you feel? You don't want to put anything else, in your stomach. There is this spectrum. And it's the result of both the GI tract and part of the brain, the hindbrain. That continuum of, I feel satisfied, I feel full. And then it's this Thanksgiving fullness. Everybody perceives these differently, but for me, they took me to the edge of nausea. What's strong enough to overcome the addictive circuits? Right? There are another set of circuits in the body called the aversive circuits. The circuits that, when we feel ill. In fact, when the first early, precursors of these drugs were given to laboratory animals, the animals didn't move. Scientists, coined the term visceral malaise, this general illness. And what the great thing is about these drugs, because of the dose, they can push you along that continuum, fullness, satiety. Some people can't tolerate these drugs because they push them over, into outright nausea. But those feelings are strong enough to, overcome the reward circuits. The problem is these drugs only work while you're on them. And the latest data that I saw is that the average person in this country is on them for 8 or 9 months. You go off them, and they stop working. But the premise of the company are that you're going to be on that for your life. I think that the FDA and the companies have to study how we can effectively use these drugs in the real world.
You're describing a couple of different processes here. One is kind of the physiological. If there's more food in my stomach and I feel full, I don't feel like I'm going to put more calories in, right? And then the other is, what's interesting to me is kind of this idea of food noise, right? Decreasing your interest in going after all foods, including the hyper addictive ones. So I wonder, when you got off the drugs, did that food noise increase?
You said it very well. That food noise is the result of those reward circuits, those addictive circuits. I mean, those are just that cue-induced wanting. I've been going off in my head that my reward circuits, are being triggered. And those aversive circuits, that edge of nausea that I felt, that sort of counterbalance those addictive circuits, that works when you're on these drugs. And they'll work for a while after you go off them. But at a certain point, this is highly variable. We're each, every individual has their own experiences. For me, it worked for a while, but what I've found and what I've tried to do is to change my relationship with food while I'm on that, what I want, and try to have that sort of condition me in a way to be able to carry over. But, I had the opportunity to co-lead Operation Warp Speed. During the pandemic, I worked 18-hour days. I was sitting there at my computer. I didn't get up, it was 7 days a week. And I turned around and I was some 40 pounds heavier afterwards. And I wanted to do something about this. These drugs are not a panacea, right? There's no magic pill. They're one tool, right? You need to take them. You can't expect to deal with these addictive circuits by yourself. You need a team. You need a good physician. You need a dietitian. You need people who can help you to change the relationship with food. And the drugs are one tool, but only one tool.
We are having this conversation about these drugs. One of the things that I definitely want to point out is that, we might have access to them, but it's very unequal access. For most people, their insurance does not cover the GLP-1 drugs. It might cover it for diabetes, but it might not cover it for weight loss.
This is not about willpower. This is very much a disease process at work, and it's causing enormous trillions of dollars of health bills these insurance companies are paying. I think one of the first things the administration has to do is to agree under Medicare to cover these drugs. Not to do that is a form of discrimination against people who struggle with obesity. We need to provide access to these drugs. I was carrying 3 different insurance policies, and not one covered these drugs. They were, over $1,000. Could you imagine struggling with your weight your whole life and being ill from it, from suffering the cardiac consequences, the renal consequences, pre-diabetes, diabetes, and a number of other complications? A drug comes along and it can help you, and you can't have access to that drug. So, it just shows you how broken the American health system is. The companies, what do? They price these drugs, exorbitantly. And there is this thing in the food and drug laws, is sort of this loophole that allows what's called compounded drugs to be made. These are drugs, not coming from the manufacturers. The source of these drugs are probably coming from China. It's hard to even know where these are, in some cases, being made. The FDA has not done testing to assure the safety. So because the drug companies have priced these drugs so high, people had to resort to drugs that they couldn't assure the safety of. Now the companies are lowering their prices to compete with these compounded drugs. That it just shows you how broken the healthcare system is.
So is there something where we can collectively figure out how to increase access to this category of drugs, while at the same time, equipping people, preparing people for a way for them to say, okay, we understand that the manufacturer says you need to be on this drug for the rest of your life. But our goal is not to have you on this drug for the rest of your life. I want you to just figure out in this interim, like, let's get you back to a healthy level. And hopefully between now and that point, we can change your relationship with food.
You've just said it wonderfully. I mean, that's the goal, but it's a journey. There is no end game right now. You and I are not going to figure out, how to you get the data to use these drugs, the right dose, whether it's safe to take that dose down. Can I go off the drug? When can I go back? Will it continue to work? Those are questions the drug company, along with the regulatory bodies, need to figure out. What our job is to do is to want to be able to deal with this toxic fat, with this sick fat, to reclaim our health, and to get a team. Again, access is a very key issue. You can't deal with an addictive substance alone. You need docs, you need nutritionists. That's what we need to do. We just have to want to reclaim our health and understand there's no end game. It's a real journey.
Former FDA Commissioner Dr. David Kessler, his new book is called Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We turn now to polarization in America, which is explored in a new memoir by author and journalist Beth Macy, who wrote the best-selling book Dopesick. Through her own childhood, town of Urbana, Ohio, Macy investigates radicalization and the struggling education system in rural America. She joins Walter Isaacson to discuss how these divisions have been stoked over the last decade.
Thank you, Biana. And Beth Macy, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. Thanks, Walter.
So your new book is called Paper Girl. Let's start with the obvious question. What'd you learn from being a paper girl back in Urbana?
Well,
Urbana,
you can't
Ohio.
call in sick because they get really mad when their paper doesn't show up. And so work ethic. And also, I always say it was great training ground for being a reporter because you had to deal with all kinds of people and you had to negotiate when people didn't want to pay you on collection day, and just great skills all the way around.
So you talk about those skills, and that's in the book in a way. You talk a lot about education, but you say education isn't just about learning knowledge, it's about learning those social skills. Is that what we're failing to do now, especially in the towns like you write about?
Yeah, I mean, my first call to a school counselor 40 years after I left that school, when I say, what is the biggest challenge today with getting kids college ready or workforce ready? She tells me it's they don't know how to human. I said, what do you mean? They don't have the social skills. They don't know the basic skills that I learned from delivering the paper every afternoon. So I thought I was going to write a story about, and I did, about how we don't have the structure in place to allow poor kids to go to college, which essentially saved my life. But after spending 2 years in Urbana, it's more a story about how our K-12 schools are declining such that people are dropping out. They're not showing up. There's a huge attendance problem, particularly after COVID. And our public schools, which are the foundation of our democracy, are in really rough shape.
Well, you started off as a local reporter in journalism, and the book sort of chronicles the fact that local journalism has declined. Is that related to the fact that people in your family, people in your town, now have their hair on fire about big old national issues that they wouldn't have talked about 30 or 40 years ago, but they don't know what's happening with their neighbors?
Absolutely. I tell the story about my brother-in-law, John, who became very politicized, starting off with Rush Limbaugh and then Fox. And then in the mid-teens, I say, hey, John, how are you doing? Because I only visit once or twice a year at that point. And he goes, deplorable. And he wants to immediately start, debating me. And my sister would have to intervene and say, we discussed this, John, no politics. And yet, when I'm starting to work on Dopesick, a book that comes out in 2018, it's possible for John to go to the library and have somebody overdose in the stall next to him, and he has no idea that there's a heroin epidemic, because he doesn't these stories aren't even being covered in his local news. And the fact-based institutions that many of us rely on are all behind a paywall. So he's getting what he gets free with his cable package. He's not reading the local news because it's just a tiny, thin shadow of its former self. And he's hearing everything from basically opinion writers and speakers who are shouting at him and stirring up his central nervous system and making him addicted to various algorithms.
Yeah, but in some ways, you say maybe he's out of touch. But isn't it also that a lot of the media and the elite got totally out of touch, too?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. When's the last time you saw a national reporter really embed in a town like Urbana, Ohio? It just simply doesn't exist. And most of our news is manufactured in cities like Washington and New York City. It took me years to convince my publishers to let me write Dope Sick because they didn't see it as an issue that was happening in New York City. I'm like, no, we've got a terrible heroin problem. It's breaking out in our suburbs, in our wealthy communities. And they thought Roanoke, Virginia, where I live, was just late getting it. So if you don't travel in these places, which many people don't, we all live in silos, you might not know. And going back to my first book, Factory Man, which came out in 2014, which was a story about the aftermath of globalization, charting, I really think of the three books as a kind of a trilogy. I was seeing all of these things, as early as 2012, but it was hard to get the gatekeepers to pay attention to them.
One of the things that struck me when you talk about education is that kids are not going to school in great numbers. They're not showing up. When did that start and why?
Well, it starts before COVID, but it really gets exacerbated in 2020 with COVID. And one of the main people I follow is a woman named Brooke Perry, who is the school attendance officer. And she put something like 150,000 miles on her car in a couple of years, traversing the county, picking up kids whose parents won't send them to school. And one of the great shocks was how many families were, quote, homeschooling. Not saying that they're all not legit homeschooling, but because homeschooling in the state of Ohio has been deregulated. You no longer have to have teachers sign off on lesson plans. This was a new law enacted by the state legislature a couple years ago. It's possible now for a parent who just doesn't want to get up in the morning, perhaps doesn't have the capacity to get up in the morning, send their kids to school, to pull their kids out from school to avoid truancy charges and say they're homeschooling. So that was an unintended consequence of that law, I would say. And it was really shocking to be, to shadow Brooke Perry and to just see the level of trauma that she sees on a daily basis. People sicking dogs at her, assaulting her, teenagers assaulting her. It really brought the mental health crisis into view.
Well, another aspect of the education crisis is people not being able to just seamlessly go to college or community college using Pell Grants and other things. Is that something that we could solve?
Yes, if we invest in people and not corporations and billionaires. So when I went to college in 1982, I went to a state college. It cost about $2+ grand a year. The Pell Grant covered my tuition, room and board, my books. It gave me work study jobs so I could have pizza and beer like everybody else. Today, that same student, I follow a young man named Silas. He couldn't go to a 4-year college because it would only cover 30%, right? So his dear mentor, his band director, his teacher talks him into doing a welding program at a community college. He gets full scholarships for it, and he doesn't really understand the money. It's rural America, so if you live in a city, you might not know that we don't have a bus that goes from Urbana to Marysville to Springfield to get Silas to his classes at the community college. And the kid goes through 5 clunker cars in the course of a 10-month program, 4 full-time jobs. I didn't have to work full-time. And the odds, and then a family with so much trauma and chaos that they are a constant drag on his psyche. And And by golly, the kid makes it. And it's a great story. It's a story of resilience. And when I shared a stage with him just about 10 days ago for the launch of the book, I said, Silas, what makes you so resilient? And he said, well, I didn't have a family I could rely on, so I created my own. Out of teachers, out of counselors. It's the school. He's going to be a great success one day, but without a hardier education system, he's a unicorn.
So let's talk about this kid, Silas, who's one of the main characters in your book. His name is Silas James. And in some ways you say he was the counterpart to you. You all are both in the band, that sort of thing. Tell me about his story, how you found him and why you made him the central character.
Well, when I first started going home, I would cast about talking to teachers and counselors and the present band director. And I was looking for a young me that would help me illustrate this data that I was finding. And they all suggested Silas James. It's a small town. They all knew him. They had all helped him. And the band, the marching band, I was president of the band my senior year, is really what kept me out of jail, kept me out of trouble. And a great affinity for my band director, who's long since passed away. And I saw that Silas had that with Mr. Sapp, who he has entered as David M. Dad in his phone. I mean, that's how important. I had one stable parent. Silas had 0 stable parents. I mean, for a time, he lived with a caregiver who molested him in his early teens while his mom was in prison for drug-related charges, and his dad was on his way to an overdose death. So he really needed the support of these folks. And, when I met him, I thought, this is a kid whose story really illustrates all the data that I'm finding on the ground.
There's a sentence in your book that just, of course, hit me, as I think you would have expected. It's, my family had once been proud of me. So walk me through the family saga and why you would write that sentence.
Well, I was the first in the family to go to college. I'm much younger than my siblings. I was the midlife accident and the only one to really move out of state. And we're pretty different. And when I started achieving some success as a journalist, they were very proud of me. But in the teens, during Trump's first term, my brother, who was my closest in age, who we'd been pretty close with, and he would come see my kid when they were in plays, unfriended me on Facebook because of, quote, all the liberal crap you post. And I'm pretty careful about what I post. I post fact-checked articles, typically from the New York Times or the Washington Post, including some of my own articles. And to sort of have my brother, malign my profession, have my friends malign my profession and say they hate the media. I said, well, Joy, you still love me, right? Yeah, of course I love you. I'm the media too. And when I write a piece for the New York Times, they'll assign some Ivy League graduate young fact checker on it who will spend 3 days on an opinion piece, making sure that my opinions are based on real data. And, she came back to me with, well, who fact checks the fact checkers? And really angry in a way I hadn't seen before. Now, she later apologized, but at some point, we have to be responsible for the truths that we believe. And, I was just, again, really shocked at the level of conspiracy theories just running roughshod over my home community.
That notion of conspiracy theories done in the recesses of the internet also plays in to your ex-boyfriend, Bill, who you decide to call out of the blue, I guess for the sake of the book. Tell me about that story.
It was definitely for the book, Walter. I wasn't trying to go back with my ex-boyfriend. No, but he was once the most liberal person I knew. And we dated for a year in 1985 or so. And he was a journalist. And as he described it, a NPR tote bag, or PBS tote bag carrying liberal. And a mutual friend who would come to my events when I would talk about my other books in Ohio said, wow, you wouldn't believe Bill. He's gone from Bernie to Jill Stein to Trump to, he's even behind Trump. And I said, what do you mean? So I got the idea. I texted him out of the blue. I said, I write books now. I'm doing this book on polarization. I'd love to talk to you about your shift in attitude. So we set up, I must have 10 hours of recordings with them. And over the course of a year and a half, I saw him get angrier and angrier. And, until finally he emerges as the lead spokesperson for the anti-Haitian contingency in Springfield, Ohio, in the lead up to the 24 election, where, Vance says and Trump says, they're eating the pets, they're eating the dogs. And there he is on PBS NewsHour. And there he is all over the news, on the front page of the Springfield paper. And he's leading rallies, and he's posting things on Twitter or X about the great replacement theory. And in February, I had finished the book, but I had to rewrite some of the end because he didn't believe in Obamacare. He was 61 when I first met him again. He didn't have health insurance because he thought it was a racket on the middle class. And in February, he gets pneumonia, and he waits too long to go to the hospital, and he dies. And when I talked to his daughter some weeks later, she basically described the same thing Bill had described about how he felt the Democrats had turned on him, and then his community turned on him when he wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And he found his community in the internet instead. He would watch, at the height of this, when I first met him, he was watching his news from Cyprus, a well-known Russian propaganda website, and he was so angry. And his daughter says, the internet killed my dad.
Your brother Tim is among those who unfriended you in Facebook. But one of the nice things about this book is that you finally have a reconciliation with him. In some ways, that's a metaphor, perhaps, of how we can solve some of these grander problems. Tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks for understanding that. We hadn't spoken in a couple of years, and because I was going back regularly, for 2 years, I would spend about a week a month in Urbana, and I would visit with my family and interview my friends and all these other people that I interviewed. And Tim and I started spending time together. And that's a really important, I get at every book event I do, people go, help, how are we going to get through Thanksgiving? And I say, you got to spend time getting to know each other as people again. And what are the things in your family? You might disagree on politics, but what are the things in your family that you remember fondly, that you're proud of? And with my family, we love to fish. We didn't have any money, but we could afford to get our own night crawlers and go out to Muzzy's Lake and go fishing. And that was something we did. So a couple years ago, my husband and I bought this modest little cabin up in the mountains, and Tim loves to fish. So I invited him up. We started spending time together. We started having these really moving conversations. Politics rarely factors in. At one point, I have a non-binary child named Sasha. Tim has never known a non-binary person before this. And Sasha's a professional musician, and Tim has heard their music and really likes it. They're in a band called Palmyra. And he starts coming to Palmyra shows. And he says, in a very tender voice, he says, tell me about Sasha. Do they still date girls? And because they asked such curiosity, I instinctively mirrored back his tone. And I said, yes, they're dating a young woman now, and I mess up the pronouns too. So meeting our relatives that might not have the same experience with diversity that we have, meeting them with grace, not just judging them or blowing up, going 0 to 60 like I did with some of my other relatives. That taught me a lot. And Tim really helped me with that. And at one point, he brings up the fact that he's going to vote for RFK. This is before Trump was, the main candidate. And I just held my tongue. I said in my head, not my cup of worms, but I'm not going to say anything because I'm loving this moment with my brother. And we got each other back.
Beth Macy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.